Texas twilight, troubles fade away like the sunlight. Off a dusty day in a Texas twilight, troubles fade away.
On New Year's Eve, 1981, in Austin, Texas, on a night like this, the brakes failed on a tractor trailer. It struck a pickup truck crossing an intersection on a green light. 19-year-old Wayne Ramirez was killed instantly. The brake failure was caused by a defective valve. The government knew of this problem at least 3 years earlier. Despite federal vehicle safety laws, the defective valve was not recalled. 3 years later, in 1984, the valve was still being used in an estimated 45,000 Mack trucks. In 1937, more than 100 patients died after taking the drug elixir sulfanilamide. Many were children who were being treated for sore throats. Among the victims, 9-year-old Joan Nidifer of Tulsa, Oklahoma. One of the drug's ingredients was revealed to be a poisonous chemical used in antifreeze. At the time, there were no government regulations requiring the testing of such drugs for safety before they were sold. In 1906, many families were fearful about eating meat after learning that some of it had been prepared from diseased animals, often under unsanitary conditions, in the nation's big meatpacking houses. In that period, there were no federal laws that effectively protected consumers against uninspected meat. Historically, the consumer has often been at risk, whether on the superhighways of the 1980s or in the apothecary shops of the 1880s. During the next hour, we will explore the record of a century of struggle to protect American consumers from unsafe food, drugs, and other products. We will see efforts by government to regulate the providers of the American dream or to have them regulate themselves. This is a look at the little-known history of a unique 20th century reform movement, the consumer movement. Often ephemeral, sometimes disorganized, frequently strident, occasionally misdirected, it is a movement that grew up with labor and the women's movement, and it is very much with us today. During this century, consumers in America have been a part of the biggest spending nation in the world. By 1984, $2,359 billion a year. They have been able to choose from more wonderfully wrought and designed goods and labor-saving devices than any other economy. And they have also experienced the darker side of the marketplace: recalls, deaths, injuries, and defective goods. There have been 3 periods in the history of consumer reform when protest was most organized and articulate. During the Progressive Era, when consumers were described as gullible victims. In the New Deal, when we were called guinea pigs, vulnerable to dangers from everyday foods, drugs, and other products. And in the 1960s and 70s, when consumer protest became part of a larger citizen movement. By the early 1960s, they were told by a president that they had certain rights: the right to choose, the right to know, the right to be safe, the right to be heard.
All of us are consumers. All of us deserve the right to be protected against fraudulent or misleading advertisements and labels, the right to be protected against unsafe or worthless drugs and other products, the right to choose from a variety of products at competitive prices.
The consumer's need to be protected has often been in conflict with the needs of business and government. By the late 1970s, this conflict focused on the question, do federal regulations improve conditions for consumers or make them worse?
Get government off the back of business and industry in America and the working man, and allow us to increase productivity.
Mr. Reagan's campaign phrase, getting the government off the backs of the people, really is getting the government off the backs of corporations, oil companies, insurance companies, in order to allow the corporations to get their hands into people's pockets. What really is at stake here is whether the government is going to enforce the law against corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, or whether it's going to be soft on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, and not enforce the law.
I believe that by carrying out the mission that we have enforcing the laws in the antitrust area and the consumer protection area, we have done the right thing. We have minimized the excesses that the agency had engaged in the past, and we've delivered the goods to the consumer and to the marketplace, making it an honest marketplace and making it a competitive marketplace.
Honesty, competition, choice. Are these values that government should define and uphold for consumers, or values that will emerge if private industry is left alone? The chairman of Foot, Cone, and Belding Advertising also heads the American Association of Advertising Agencies.
I hope that someday there will be absolutely no question about the consumer's interests and the advertiser's interests being identical, and advertising not only reflecting absolute accuracy in what it says, but also a recognition of the consumer's sense and sensibilities and treating that person like an adult human being.
Honesty, fair dealing are at the heart of what the consumer movement is after. Not just because individual consumers may win or lose a buck because of it, but these qualities, these values are at the heart of a civilized society. They're the building blocks of a civil society where we are all interdependent. And they are essential not only for the consumer, but for democracy to survive.
As early as the 18th century, the economist Adam Smith noted the tension between consumer and producer when he said that the sole end and purpose of production is consumption, and yet the interest of the consumer is almost constantly sacrificed to that of the producer. In the colonial era, the first laws to protect consumers were established. One of them, enacted in Massachusetts in 1785, reads in part, "If any person shall sell any diseased, corrupted, or unwholesome provisions, knowing the same without making it known to the buyer, he shall be punished by fine, imprisonment, or by standing in the pillory." A century later, in the 1880s, the modern American consumer movement had its beginnings. Swept along by the social upheavals of the Industrial Revolution, we became a country whose gross national product expanded within a decade by almost half again. Newly patented harvesters and combines were able to bag 450 pounds of grain every minute. Packaged cereals appeared for the first time. The Industrial Revolution's machinery helped mass produce ivory soap. It enabled such brands as Nabisco to establish a mass market. The transcontinental railroad networks opened a national market to food processors and meat packers. But the packers and canners' grasp of the principles of food preservation and bacteriology was still primitive. Little did families of the time know that formaldehyde was frequently used to preserve meats, while canned peas were doused with highly toxic copper sulfate to simulate the look of freshness at the dinner table.
In the general store, ways of buying for the home changed. Industrial technology had transformed the basic routines of daily life. Instead of seeing, feeling, even tasting for freshness, we were now buying by brand. And what was behind that brand name? How good was it? What was inside? Who made it? Under what conditions? A man working an 18-hour factory shift, a child in a sweatshop, a woman at the loom doing piecework, all of them working for a boss that probably none would ever meet. What it meant to us as consumers, as families, was that we all faced a common difficulty: how to buy economically, efficiently, and safely. At this time, out of the industrial age, with its assembly lines and turbines, its cauldrons and crucibles, with its mass-produced goods, the leaders of a national consumer movement emerged.
Some of the first consumer leaders saw themselves as pioneers in the new science of home economics. Among them, Ellen Swallow Richards, the first woman admitted to and graduated from MIT. She became a chemist and an outspoken consumer advocate. The methods of our mothers and grandmothers will no longer apply, she said. They had no trouble with their soap, for they superintended its making and knew its properties. We buy everything and have no idea of the processes by which the articles are produced and have no means of knowing beforehand what the quality may be. The views of home economists appeared regularly in such magazines as Good Housekeeping, which in 1902 developed a seal for products it approved and advertised. Ladies' Home Journal introduced the money-back guarantee. Woman's Home Companion and Collier's declared war against what they called dishonest food. Among the most recklessly advertised and dangerous products were patent medicines. In an era in which some doctors were still indiscriminately prescribing bloodletting by leeches, patent medicines promised to cure everything from tonsillitis to typhoid. Many contained cocaine and morphine. Some not only failed to cure as promised, but were unsafe with disastrous results, including addiction and death. In the October 1905 issue of Collier's, the muckraking journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams wrote, "Gullible America will spend this year some $75 million in the purchase of patent medicines. It will swallow huge quantities of alcohol, an appalling amount of opiates and narcotics, and far in excess of all other ingredients, undiluted fraud." Stirred by such articles, many readers became activists in the first consumer groups. Attacking the problems of patent medicines and other dangerous products and the conditions under which they were made was the National Consumers League, the first national consumer organization, founded in 1899. Present member of the executive board of the National Consumers League, Carolyn Ware.
It was part of the social movement of the turn of the century, which was concerned with the social responsibility. And the emphasis was on the responsibility of the buyer and the user of products toward the people who produced those products. And so the conditions of manufacture, the conditions of industrial homework, the conditions of sweatshops, labor standards, these were the initial focuses of the National Consumers League.
An 11-year-old. He works 60 hours a week at the Pennsylvania Coal Company mine in Pittston. He has tuberculosis. A 15-year-old department store clerk. She earns $3 for 72 hours of work. A 12-year-old. She stands 60 hours a week at the weaving machines. She makes 75 cents a day. These conditions outraged and motivated the National Consumers League, whose members were mostly educated professional women, many from the middle and upper classes. There were local chapters in many cities. With Florence Kelley as national president, the League used a white label to designate shops and factories meeting minimum labor standards. It was an effective means of boycott. Working for the League were volunteer lawyers Louis Brandeis and later Felix Frankfurter. Both were to serve on the Supreme Court. It was Frankfurter who argued, "We do not simply consume goods and services. We consume the lives that go into those goods and services." By 1906, as the problem of adulterated food gained widespread attention, the comprehensive federal pure food and drug law became a major goal of the League. In its fight, it was joined by such established groups as the General Federation of Women's Clubs and by little-known activists such as Alice Lakey. They found an ally in a chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley of the United States Department of Agriculture. Dr. Wiley was dedicated to the pure food movement, along with his young colleagues. Many of them were volunteers known as the Poison Squad because they actually consumed all kinds of food additives and reported their symptoms to Wiley. A song of the day about the squad went, On prussic acid we break our fast, we lunch on morphic stew. We dine on match head consommé and drink carbolic acid brew. Thus all the deadlines we double dare to put us beneath the sod. We're death immune and proud as proud. Hooray for the poison squad. Then a novel appeared, one of the best sellers of all time, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which included an expose of the working conditions found in Chicago's meatpacking houses. Its description of adulteration techniques and the lack of sanitation standards revolted and outraged the American public. Sinclair wrote, "The rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them and they would die. And then rats, bread, and meat, and sometimes workers, would go into the hoppers together." President Theodore Roosevelt launched an independent investigation of the charges. When it confirmed Sinclair's expose, Roosevelt put his support behind meat inspection legislation. As a result, in part, of organized protest by consumer groups who vigorously lobbied the Senate, two major consumer laws finally made their way through Congress.
The passage of the 1906 Food and Drug Act and of the Meat Inspection Act suggests a pattern in the adoption of consumer reforms, a pattern that seems to recur throughout the history of the consumer movement. First, there is a disaster, as in the case of the diseased meat and patent medicine scandals. Then there is research, investigations undertaken by scientists or by groups like the National Consumers League or by journalists to help expose the problem. Next, there is a groundswell of protest from an outraged public leading to a demand for legislation. Then a regulatory bill emerges, often so flawed by compromise that it takes another disaster and another struggle to get the law amended.
One shortcoming of the 1906 Food and Drug Bill was that products did not have to be proven safe and effective before going on the market. Another was that the bill did not require ingredients to be listed on the label. By 1907, another type of risk threatened consumers. Corporations banding together as trusts had acquired control of most of the basic goods and services. They not only controlled production, but tried to control pricing. One critic lamented that the consumer's life was controlled by the so-called robber barons. Nowadays, I let the meat trust butcher my pig, the oil trust mold my candles, and the barbed wire trust split my rails. Growing hostility to trusts led to the creation of the Federal Trade Commission by Woodrow Wilson in 1914. Its mandate was to prevent unfair competition by corporations and to enforce the 1890 Sherman antitrust laws. But any action the fledgling FTC might take was temporarily preempted by World War I. The drive for efficiency and standardization that worked for the military soon became a consumer expectation. At the war's end, America entered an age of abundance. The problem was no longer how to produce enough, but how to consume enough. One of the most important 20th century political economists, Thorstein Veblen, observed that many, especially the middle class, sought to achieve status through what he called conspicuous consumption, flaunting of leisure purchases and emulation of the rich. Mass production, mass marketing and selling, mass distribution, all demanded access to American homes. Enter advertising. Advertising pioneer Alfred Seaman.
People wanted the things which said success. They wanted the things which made their life more enjoyable. There's one advertisement I remember seeing for General Electric. It's Christmas morning, and the woman is in sheer ecstasy because her Christmas present is a refrigerator. See, it wasn't just the everyday utility that mattered. That was important, but it was also symbolic, It was something to be proud of and to show to your friends, and it was part of the upward mobility that families were having.
Advertising shaped mass taste and behavior. It sold the cigarette habit to the American public using Hollywood stars and models in diaphanous dress. Its message was clear. Smoking was not only acceptable, but stylish. Advertising expenditures, virtually nothing before 1880, had by 1920 risen to $3 billion. Much of it comprised the newest form of fiction.
This was a happy time for advertising. The social forces, the forces of our daily lives, were moving hand in hand with advertising. And you were going, you the consumer, were going into the land of the sunrise or the land of the sunset, depending on your point of view.
But in fact, it was not a happy time for everyone. In the 1920s, most Americans did not earn nearly enough to live the kind of life the ads promoted. In 1927, the first broad attack on American advertising appeared with the best-selling book, Your Money's Worth. Its authors were F.J. Schlink, an engineer, and Stuart Chase, a liberal economist. They warned, "We are all Alices in a wonderland of conflicting claims, bright promises, fancy packages, soaring words, and almost impenetrable ignorance." They proposed scientific product testing to help the consumer make a more informed choice. But many consumers, short on cash and seduced by the ads, bought on credit, on paper, on margin, including stocks. With a poorly handled money supply, with speculation built into the system, with a fragile, unsound marketplace, Wall Street crashed.
The latest news has struck me funny. Says you have no friends if you haven't got money. And all of us good folks in distress, but I'm gonna get something off of my chest.
During the Depression, Stuart Chase's second book, A New Deal, gave Franklin Delano Roosevelt a social agenda and a campaign slogan.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
For consumers, the 30s were to be a decade of major reform and organized action.
But to win.
One of the key elements in FDR's program was the establishment of the National Recovery Administration. The Blue Eagle was the logo, to eliminate price wars and stabilize production. Serving on the Consumer Advisory Board of the NRA was Carolyn Ware.
The original idea was that the National Recovery Administration should rescue industry by drafting codes of fair competition with an advisory body for labor and an advisory body for business. And Mary Rumsey was responsible for making sure that the third leg of the three-legged stool, the consumer, was included in that structure.
Now that the federal government and the whole country realizes that consumer prosperity is the best policy, we must rid ourselves of the fear of fear. And we must cooperate with our great president under the Blue Eagle and his plan to the fullest extent of our power. We must not fail it.
And now listen to the housewives of America.
We as women, spenders and managers of the family income, have an opportunity and an obligation to support the NRA through wise spending with firms that are behind the Blue Eagle. I only buy in stores that belong to the NRA because I think it's the quickest way to increase employment.
When y'all join the NRA.
By 1934, the NRA was under siege. Consumers were complaining about rising prices. Business and labor were unhappy with some provisions of the codes, and the Supreme Court finally declared it unconstitutional. But a legacy of the NRA's Consumer Advisory Board was that it helped form grassroots consumer groups on the state and local levels. In Massachusetts, the Consumers Institute guided low-income families toward more economical buying. The St. Louis Consumers Council protested against the sale of impure milk. And a group in Little Rock, Arkansas lived up to its name, the Society for the Booing of Commercial Advertisements in Motion Picture Houses. Among the many significant consumer activities in the 1930s was the growth of cooperatives. These groups of consumers joined together to increase their buying power, provide services, and protect one another. Especially successful were rural electrification cooperatives. Describing what they meant to the people of the Southwest is E. Babe Smith, an early activist.
Well, the farm families at that time, they had wood stoves for cooking and heating. The water was drawn by rope from the well or from a spring, which they carried it for any number of 200 or 300 yards from the farmhouses. And kerosene lights were the order of the day. It was just coming out of the Depression. And to get REA started at $5 were a lot of money to get electrification. And we had public meetings, asked the people to come in and to listen. And we had speakers like the county judge and other prominent people to tell the benefits of rural electrification. I don't think you people really realize what the position of the women were in the rural electrification movement. The women having carry water, cook on a wood stove, and iron with an old flat iron, they were enthusiastic about it and would make most any sacrifice.
At the same time that consumer cooperatives were proving successful at the regional level, members of many consumer clubs and women's groups nationwide were waging a difficult fight to reform the 1906 Food and Drug Law. The inadequacy of the law was exposed in a series of books, starting with the bestseller 100 Million Guinea Pigs, the searing indictment by F.J. Schlink and Arthur Callett. It influenced one of Roosevelt's key advisors, Rexford Tugwell, who drafted an early version of a new law. Another expose, American Chamber of Horrors, written by Ruth DeForest Lamb of the Food and Drug Administration, also shocked the nation. Its title was as ominous as the effects of the cosmetics it condemned. The 1906 law had not provided any safety regulations for cosmetics. The American Home Economics Association and feminists such as Anna Kelton Wiley, widow of Dr. Harvey Wiley, were among those quick to protest. They met powerful opposition from the drug industry, which argued that new regulations might prevent beneficial new products from reaching the market. As the debate continued, another tragedy, its impact comparable to the meat and patent medicine scandals of the early 1900s, set the stage for new legislation.
In 1937, a liquid form of one of the new sulfa wonder drugs was placed on the market. In announcing its new product, the maker, S.E. Massengill Company, said, "Our research department has just released an elixir sulfanilamide, 40 grams to the fluid ounce. It is ideal for your patients who can take liquids but little else. Also, it is not unpleasant to take, so it is suitable for children." The Massengill chemists found that sulfanilamide could dissolve in diethylene glycol to create its liquid form. They failed to note, however, one characteristic of the solution. Diethylene glycol is a chemical routinely used as an antifreeze, and as such is a deadly poison. In 1937, existing scientific literature indicated that diethylene glycol was toxic and could cause kidney damage or failure. But because the 1906 Food and Drug Law did not require safety studies on new drugs, the elixir was not tested for toxicity. Into the marketplace and onto the pharmacist's shelves it went in early September 1937. By October, the tragedy was already full-blown. It was learned that elixir sulfanilamide had been responsible for the deaths of more than 100 patients. Many of the victims were children who were being treated for sore throats. Ironically, the recall of the elixir was made possible under existing law only because of misbranding. If it had been called a solution instead of an elixir, no charge of violating the law could have been made.
The firm's owner, Dr. Samuel Massengill, said, "I do not feel any responsibility on our part." The firm's chemist, after learning of the effects of the liquid drug, committed suicide.
Finally, on June 30th, 1938, the new Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was signed into law. The new drug section of the bill gave the agency regulatory power that provided a greater measure of drug safety and consumer protection.
That law seemed to satisfy no one. Drug companies damned the bill as an interference with consumer choice and the right of self-medication. Consumer activists insisted that the provisions ensuring product safety and preventing fraudulent advertising were inadequate. The FDA believed that the sulfanilamide experience had at least resulted in a shift in drug regulation, placing the burden of safety on the manufacturer before the product could be put on the market. America was finally coming out of the Depression. At the 1939 New York World's Fair, celebrated by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and Kate Smith, there was the world of tomorrow, with products no one had ever before envisioned. Such consumer exhibits as GM's Futurama drew the largest crowds. Consumer activists wondered, would technology control us, or we control it? But the world of tomorrow was deferred by World War II. On the home front, the protection of some basic consumer interests was the mandate of the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. The OPA set a ceiling on prices and rationed such scarce goods as meat and gasoline. With victory came the post-war spending boom.
The reconversion of war plants to peacetime pursuits is going ahead at full speed. Yes, soon you'll have that long-awaited refrigerator in the kitchen, along with a new stove. The assembly lines are rolling merrily. If your radio goes dead, cheer up. There'll be 1 million available by Christmas. Store windows are once more blossoming as they did before Pearl Harbor, with every gadget dear to Americans. Peace, it's wonderful.
I love this house. I absolutely love it. I think it's the sweetest house I ever saw.
A house is just the trimmings. The real comfort a guy gets these days is the feeling that everything is on a pretty solid basis for everybody. None of that roller coaster stuff like after the last war that lets you down with a dizzy drop.
Our icebox doesn't need any light because it's made of glass. It's between the kitchen and the dining room, which saves a lot of steps. I kind of like this lazy.
Indeed, for many families, the 1950s was not a decade on a roller coaster. Instead, it was an express train of new products, new appliances, of advertising adjectives and hyperbole, carrying the message of unremitting faith in the American dream, that each generation would be better off, more comfortable than the last. The invention that changed the way we bought and used products was this box of wires. Not since the 1920s and radio had consumers been confronted with so many entreaties to buy, whispered and shouted in so many ways.
Presenting Harry James.
Okay, fellas. Now let's take the trumpets with the new Kleenex tissues tied on them. Soak them. And swing!
There was a period of abuse when, in order to find some perhaps minor product feature differentiation, an advertiser would have his product tested by a sort of in-house or set-up product testing facility in order to prove that his product was 10% faster or 15% more durable than the competitor's product.
With a beard tough as sandpaper. That's how it used to feel when I shaved. Sandpaper. Until I got Palmolive.
The abuses occurred in commercials such as this for Rapid Shave, which promised to give easier shaves. The in-house shaving test claimed to be done on sandpaper. Actually, it was sand on plexiglass. The commercial was ordered withdrawn by the FTC. Objective product testing had been pioneered as early as 1927 by Consumers Research magazine, started by F.J. Schlink. It carried no advertising. In 1936, Consumers Union, led by Arthur Callett and Colston Warren, launched its own product testing magazine, Consumer Reports, which also accepted no advertising. Later, it reported on a range of problems from auto safety design to cigarette advertising. Product testing sought to provide useful information to help the consumer in making an informed choice. But it was also necessary to have information about the expanding business of credit, installment plans, charge accounts, revolving credit plans, all crucial, or so it seemed, for the good life. Especially for low-income families, abuses in installment plans proved to be devastating. Many attacked this problem on the federal, state, and local levels. In New York, Governor Averell Harriman appointed economist Persia Campbell to head the nation's first consumer affairs office at the state level.
I live in a house. Oh, what a
Campbell fought to end excessive finance charges. She worked to reform a system that permitted the wages of low-income families to be garnished, that is, assigned to merchants with whom the poor had signed fraudulent installment contracts. Before the passage of the federal truth in lending laws, the problems of the poor were documented in a 1967 NET program, The Poor Pay More. A hidden camera segment when a freezer plan salesman comes to call. He guarantees replacement of freezer and food if the appliance breaks down.
If the unit breaks down, and I've seen Cadillacs and Rolls Royces broken down on the side of the road. I don't care how good it is. If it's mechanical, something can go wrong with it. It's possible to break down.
So what you're trying to say is if it breaks down,
If it breaks
you
down,
come
we'll
out and
repair
fix
it.
it.
That's number one. Number two, if you lose food for any reason, whether it be breakdown of the unit or whether it be a blackout.
Florence Rice of the Harlem Consumer Education Council describes how existing laws were widely disregarded.
The salesman tells you, he doesn't write it down, but he tells you if it breaks down, they'll repair it. Well, I have documented cases and witnesses of people who it has broke down. It's cost them from $40, $50 to $90 to repair it themselves. They have not repaired it. And also, these people have been garnished. The people that I'm speaking about have been garnished. And this whole food freezer plan is the biggest fraud that I know there is.
Influenced by the civil rights movement, consumer reformers began to respond to the needs of low-income minorities. The 60s and 70s became the most activist decades in the history of consumer reform. At the White House, a president declared a consumer bill of rights for the first time. He spoke of the need for improved drug regulation and supported stronger safety amendments to the 1938 law.
Every year, new chemicals are being added to our food or sprayed on crops. 90% of the prescriptions written today are for drugs which were unknown 20 years ago.
The action taken by a government official, Dr. Francis Kelsey, prevented a new drug, thalidomide, from being used by American consumers. Once again, a tragedy brought attention to the crucial need for changing the laws. The drug had been used in England and Germany to prevent morning sickness, with disastrous results.
At the time the application was submitted, there were perhaps 40 to 60 doctors reported as having used the drug. Later, when we went back to examine the company files, we found it had been distributed to over 1,000 doctors who had used the drugs, often without a great deal of control and often without adequate reports on the results.
I'm sure
Had Dr. Kelsey allowed the drug to be released in the United States, it was estimated that some 10,000 deformed babies would have been born before the danger was known.
Appreciate what you've done.
The near disaster forced Congress to enact a major new amendment improving control and marketing of prescription drugs. Advisors to Kennedy recommended that he appoint the first special consumer assistant with direct access to a president. After Kennedy's death, Esther Peterson was appointed by Lyndon Johnson. She remembers her first press conference.
I'll never get one of these reporters said, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I want everybody to know that the consumer thing is important. Well, how are they going to find out? Oh, my God, how are they going to find out? So I said, I'll have conferences. That's where the regional conferences started.
Over is really a magnificent instrument for the consumers to rally around and now finally to have really a real direct voice.
Can they write you? I said, of course. I want to hear from people. Where do they write you? And I thought, my God, where do they write me? I haven't even got an office. So I gulped and I said, the White House. And I thought, here's where I'm going to be fired. I don't even have an office there. But let me tell you, it was the best mistake I made. It was the mistake. I got back 3 days later. That was Friday, and then it was the New Year's, and I'll never forget. I had a cold one day. And do you know, there were boxes of letters in a little room that they had found for me over in the EOB. And you know what? I got friends to come, and we took those letters, and we put what was about packaging, what was about credit, what was about additives, and that's how we built the program, from the people.
For most people, the single issue that pulled together many themes of consumer reform was auto safety. The struggle between a young lawyer named Ralph Nader and General Motors became a vivid symbol of consumer protest. Nader claimed that GM's Chevrolet Corvair was unsafe at any speed.
Well, back in 1965, General Motors hired a private detective firm to follow me around because they'd read some of my articles in newspapers criticizing them. And they followed me right down to the Capitol one day and lost me in the Capitol. The detectives rushed up to the Capitol Guard and said, "Do you see a person by this description?" And the Capitol Guard said, "What are you doing here following someone?" And they were caught. And of course, there's a federal law that says anybody who tries to intimidate a congressional witness can get into serious trouble. So the newspapers started investigating. They called up all the auto companies and said, "Are you following this young lawyer?" And Ford said no, AMC said no, Chrysler said no, and GM said no comment. And that was the beginning of the end, and GM had to admit that they did this, and there was a big congressional hearing where the president of GM came down and apologized.
I am not here to excuse, condone, or justify in any way our investigating Mr. Nader. To the extent that General Motors bears responsibility, I want to apologize here and now to the members of this subcommittee and Mr. Nader. I sincerely hope that these apologies will be accepted.
With a $280,000 portion of the legal settlement from General Motors as seed money, Nader continued his crusade. If some perceived him to be Arthur, his knights at the Round Table were Nader's raiders, many of whom came to Washington direct from the college campus. The struggle for protection from adulterated meat, begun at the turn of the century, continued as LBJ honored Upton Sinclair.
Stand up, please. He was then in his 90s, and I remember going up to him and said, "Well, Mr. Sinclair, here we go again." And he said, "There's no end to the fight, is there?"
In the tradition of the figures of the progressive era, Dr. Harvey Wiley, Florence Kelley, National Consumers League lawyers Brandeis and Frankfurter, Nader brought passion and a sense of urgency to consumer reform. He also brought an ideology, a bitterly anti-corporate view. As one observer noted, he looked under the hood of American industry and found an engine egregiously out of tune with his sense of moral accountability. The very word consumerism seems to have come into the vocabulary with Nader. The term suggested for the first time that consumer reform was an ideology rather than a pragmatically oriented movement.
And Mr. Nader, by his activities in Washington, and by encouraging...
While other reformers placed their hopes for consumer protection on product testing and research, Nader's energies were directed more toward arousing congressional attention and action. As in the 1930s, consumer groups had been attracting new members and broadening their base. Among these groups, the American Council on Consumer Interests, Consumer Federation of America, food cooperatives and credit unions, and groups such as those that took to the streets in 1973 to protest against soaring meat prices.
DC Americans for Democratic Action.
Their nationwide boycott temporarily succeeded in lowering prices at the meat counter.
Consumers have pressure, and we're going to bring all the prices down right across the board.
In Pittsburgh, the newly organized Alliance for Consumer Protection picketed local merchants on behalf of consumers.
What I learned was that there were other organizations throughout the United States that were independent of us, but were doing the same kind of thing. And I learned about something called the consumer movement without knowing it in advance. We just were part of it.
An important achievement for consumer groups was a ban on television cigarette advertising. One weapon was the counter commercial. The record of consumer legislative reform passed in the late 1960s and 70s was impressive. It included major bills on auto and highway safety, truth in packaging and lending, credit, product safety, and warranties. In 1977, the reformers tried to pass an ambitious bill for a new federal consumer protection agency, an idea first proposed in the 1930s. And the business community launched an organized counterattack.
During the consumer movement's heydays, OSHA was created, EPA was created, the Consumer Product Safety Commission was created, consumer laws were moving willy-nilly through the Congress, warranty laws, truth in packaging laws, if you will. The American business community believed there were already enough consumer laws moving. You didn't need another agency on top of all the others. Make those that are already here work. And that's as simplistic as I can make it, because there were already enough lawyers and regulations bombarding them that they didn't want the specter of yet a super agency on top of that.
Such critics felt that excessive regulation inflated prices to consumers, stifled innovation, and drained competitive forces in the economy by adding an exorbitant cost burden to industry. In the late 1970s, a major target of such deregulatory sentiment was the Federal Trade Commission and its proposed new rules. Among them, new regulations for the life insurance industry, used car dealers, and TV ads directed at children for sugar-coated cereals. In each case, it was rebuffed. Herb Bloch's cartoon is captioned, "This agency is guilty of acting like a regulatory agency." The FTC's chairman in 1984, James C. Miller, believes it was then an agency out of control.
Well, in the antitrust area, it was engaged in what someone characterized as Star Trek law enforcement. That's boldly going where no man had dared to go before. And it lost, in fact, 60% of its cases on appeal. And in the consumer protection area, it was engaged in what even the Washington Post characterized as national nannyism. And so those excesses, I think, needed to be reined in, and Congress essentially told the agency to cut out the excesses.
What those laws basically said is that while we don't really like government intervening in much of our lives, and we never have as Americans, we recognize that business, especially larger businesses, is subject to a whole range of temptations. And government is the only legitimate restraining force for those temptations, whether it be unfair methods of competition to drive competitors out of business, or the temptation to lie in advertising, or to exploit the vulnerable in our society.
Even if the FTC had been able to get all the new rules it wanted, that would have been only part of the battle. Another aspect, as perceived by consumer activists, lay in the enforcement of laws already on the books. The tragedy that took a young life in Austin, Texas, despite existing federal vehicle safety regulations, is a case in point. Coming down the road was a 1979 Mack tractor trailer carrying U.S. mail. The driver of the trailer applied his brakes when he saw the caution light. Suddenly, he had no brakes. He honked his horn and tried to flash his lights. The truck proceeded through the intersection. It broadsided a pickup truck, killing 19-year-old Wayne Ramirez instantly. Court records from a 1984 lawsuit show that as early as 1977, there were numerous reports of truck brake failure traced to a faulty valve made by the Wagner Electric Corporation. By November of 1979, complaints had come to the attention of the Federal Office of Defects Investigation. ODI began an inquiry, asking Mack Truck for details. Mack and Wagner engineers met at Mack headquarters in Allentown, Pennsylvania on December 6, 1979. A memo of that meeting was introduced as evidence during the trial. In it, a Mack executive advised that there were two options. One, a total recall of some 45,000 trucks at a cost of $50 a truck. Two, what was termed the soft approach, to contend that the claim of a faulty brake valve had no merit and not to recall. According to trial testimony, Mack and Wagner chose the soft approach. By the end of 1984, despite safety regulations already on the books, the defective valves costing $6.39 each were still on the road in thousands of Mack trucks as well as in those of other companies. Attorney for the plaintiff, Tom Harkness.
Mack Truck and Wagner kept $2.25 million in their pockets back in that corporate boardroom in December of 1979 when they didn't recall the valve. Jenny Davis lost a son. And I can't accept that as an individual that has to go out and drive on our streets and roads.
The day is closing and the sky's on fire, breeze is blowing, full of burning desire. Day is closing.
Well, the struggle for economic justice is best done by those who are victims. They're the ones who have the greatest stake in improving the system. They're the ones who want to make government defend victims, not represent perpetrators. And that's why I think that the cardinal economic movement in this country is the consumer movement.
Of course, no one wants to have unsafe products, or no one wants to have dirty air or suffer other kinds of health impairments. But our resources in the nation as a whole are limited. We can afford only so much given over to these areas.
It is the Congress's obligation, the government's obligation, to protect consumers against things they cannot protect themselves against.
What then is the answer to why Americans have been so often at risk in the marketplace? We have seen throughout the history of consumer reform that there are no simple, enduring solutions, that consumer protection is not attained merely by writing a new regulation or by dismantling old ones. Different challenges to our safety, to our health, and to our economic well-being may require different responses, not only from Washington, but from grassroots groups, that loosely organized coalition sometimes called the consumer movement.
I don't know where the money comes from, just out of a Social Security check, which is very small. And therefore, our utility bills are extremely too high.
In San Antonio, Texas, a health care clinic was organized by low-income consumers. In Laurel, Maryland, the Citizens Labor Energy Coalition petitions against rising home heating prices. The consumer movement was born out of the social turbulence of the industrial age. More than a century later, the question remains, will organized consumer protest continue as a vibrant force in our history, or will it fade away into the deregulatory atmosphere of the 1980s?
Consumers have to organize. They have to organize at the grassroots, and they have to organize in the kind of coalitions with other groups who are really seeking economic justice, economic democracy.
It is increasingly difficult because of the increasing complexity, rapidity of change, technological development, and organizational power of which confront the consumer, but the vision is still there and the need is still there, and I think even greater.
As we move ahead in society with the technological development, there are all kinds of problems. There will always be areas where the user, must be considered. The big thing is, will we have people who are aware of this? Will they have their head up? Will they look? Will they have the information to make these decisions? And if they do, then I think all is going to be well and good.
The author of Your Money's Worth, published in 1927, Stuart Chase, is now in his 90s. He is still asking the same questions, still giving voice to consumer protest.
According to Mr. Chase, the consumer is still Alice. The marketplace is still Wonderland.
It is the consumer's move. If he wants to leave Wonderland, there is a way out, and the clear possibility of drastically reducing the cost of living. He can get his money's worth if he is willing to organize to get it. The market always responds to organized pressure. Yes, sir.
Funding for this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the following organizations: